So in this video, I'll be talking about how to use the transform property to translate an element. And what I mean by translate an element is how can I use transform to move the element, okay? With transform property, you basically can do three things to an element. You can rotate it around, you can move it around, and you can scale it, make it bigger or smaller. And in this video, we're talking about how do I move it around or translate it. Now, before I actually talk about the property itself, let me just draw with CSS the actual thing we're moving around. So let's create a divider, and let's give it a class of A. Let's throw some text inside. This is text. And now let's give the CSS property for this particular give it a height of 300 pixels. Give it a width of 300 pixels. Let's give it a background color of red. So let's move this element a bit closer to the middle. So let's set margin top to 200 pixels. And let's set the margin left to 300 pixels. So anyway, so far this is what our design looks like in the browser. I've centered it a little bit. Doesn't need to be perfectly in the center. That's not too important, but just a bit more convenient. Now I've got that easy part over. Now let me next explain how to use the transform property to translate something. How you use translate is like this, right? Translate, sort of like a function in programming. And there are two values. Inside of translate, you input two values. The first value is how much you want to move this element sideways along the x-axis, if you may. And a positive value means I'm moving it towards the right. A negative value means I'm moving it towards the left. So if I write 300 pixels here, that means I'm moving the element 300 pixels to the right. Comparatively, I have moved it 300 pixels to the right. And the next thing here is how I want to move it up or down. Okay, this is the y-axis. So example, if I set this to 1,000, this is how the element will change. See, it's been moved downwards. So a positive value moves it downwards. A negative value moves it upwards. Now let me actually illustrate to you the movements using an animation because I think it's probably actually easier that way. So let me do that. Let me create an animation. And we'll just create it and call it move. Let it happen over 2 seconds and happen. We don't need to set it to infinite because I'm just showing you once. So let's create the keyframes for it. So it's at 0. Don't want any translation. At 0. And at 100, let me show you what happens when you move. Let's say I want to translate it 500 pixels, right? Towards the right. This is what it will look like in the browser. See, that was what happens if I set the first translate value positive. So what happens if I set a negative value? See, negative value in the x, the first one, moves it towards the left. Now let me show you what happens if I set the second value to positive. Moves downwards. And if I set this to a negative value, this moves it upwards. So one more thing before closing, you can also use something like translate x. And this just means I'm moving the x-axis. So for example, you can do basically the same type of thing with translate y. So basically this is typically used when you're trying to draw animations. You're actually trying to do some kind of design, like you're going to move a character around in CSS and JavaScript. So this is where it typically would be used. But anyways, this about finishes this video. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions, as usual, please feel free to let me know, and I'll see you next time.